We are so knackered, we had to restart this podcast because our recording options weren't well suited. Hey everyone, it's Joseph Lavoie here. Welcome to Craft Politics.
I'm Andrew Percy. Good to see everyone.
And the reason we're knackered is it's post-election. April 29th is when we're recording this. We are going to have Sean Spear on the show tomorrow to do a deep dive, but we thought we'd do a super fast, cheeky half. Andrew, I'm drinking a Dead Frog Brewery pepper lime lager to spice me up a little bit and wake me up today. What are you drinking?
Good. I'm in a hole. I'm Dale Dug a Hole by Backcountry Brewing, who are obviously Squamish. I've had Backcountry before. I love Backcountry. I think a hole seems to be a relevant metaphor for things. And can I just say, I said this on the one that we had to restart because I apparently got the echo cancellation wrong. But I look like shit because I've done 7 constituencies in 3 provinces. And I was in Edmonton last night, didn't really get much sleep because we had the party afterwards, and then I had to get up at 5 this morning to get to the airport to fly to Vancouver. So that's why I look like shit.
I didn't really notice much of a difference, but hey.
Oh dear, you're gonna regret that very much.
Well, if
I'm going
you only
to destroy you, Joseph Lavoie.
I take it all back. I'm so sorry. See, I can't dish it out. So in case you are living under a rock, of course, the news today is that the Liberals under Mark Carney have won what appears to be, unless some dramatic last minute changes occur, they have won a minority government with 169 seats. Recall, you need 172 to form a majority. The Conservatives with 144, Black Québécois with 22, and the NDP with the absolute total collapse down to 7 votes, losing party status. It was one hell of a night, wasn't it? I mean, I went to bed so damn late because I just couldn't stop watching. It was just so interesting.
Yeah, I think the weird thing for me was it's unusual for anyone's listening from the UK, right? All our results start coming in about the same time because the polling stations are all open the same time because we've got one time zone. So you start getting results in from like where it's across the country, even though they stagger the polling stations to close in similar times. But we started getting the Atlantic provinces one, and it looked like the Conservatives had actually done really well in the Atlantic or outperformed in the Atlantic provinces. And I think at one point up to 10 or 11 seats, went into the election, I think, with 8 in the Atlantic provinces. And actually it looks like I've come out with 7, which is almost bang on to what the polls were suggesting. So for a moment, it looked like everybody was going to be, and quite a few of these seats looked like they were going to flip. And then all of a sudden, this advanced polling seemed to those numbers seemed to get added later in some constituencies than others. And that just seemed to move everything. Like Port Moody Coquitlam here in BC. I dared to believe that Paul Lambert, nice guy, I was hoping he was going to win. I even sent him some money because of the splits. That was an NDPC. I thought if they can hold 20%, maybe he'll win. And he looked to be leading. And then apparently advanced polls came in and he's lost it, relatively comfortably. So
that is something else I noticed. I was watching so many ridings because I have a couple friends running, particularly in Ontario, and same thing. It was looking really strong for them all night long. They're in the lead. And then the advanced poll numbers came in and then total flip. So when the advanced poll rush occurred, you heard a lot of Liberals say we're very confident that a lot of those advanced voters were ours, that we did very well. I was at first skeptical of that because usually Conservatives are very good at mobilizing their own vote. And I thought, well, everyone's just excited and motivated. But it does seem there was a larger share of sort of progressive or liberal-leaning voters who showed up on advanced polling dates compared to E-Day.
When I was doing the bingo sheets mark-off in one of the seats here, which is the, where in the advanced polls they tell you the polling numbers of people who voted, it was very often 2 numbers together, which suggests couples. And in my mind, all I could think was older couples wandering down to the polling station, like in the UK. That's normally older couples. It's normally a good thing for the Conservatives. And all I was thinking is, this looks to me, there seemed to be a lot of them and not a lot of single ones, which right. If it was young people coming out to vote in this youthquake, which as you know, I've poo-pooed from day one, the idea that young people were going to outvote older people or turn out in such numbers that they would reduce the Liberals' advantage with over 55s. I just thought it was a complete bollocks from day one, and it seems to have been. And I was looking on these bingo sheets, and I was just thinking, it's older voters coming out, so that's probably going to advantage the Liberals. It looked like that, just because it was, the 2 numbers together.
My take of this is, what's occurred is that Canadians have voted for both change and stability, and They have neither.
Yes.
So, yeah, they think they got the change piece because many Canadians, I do think, genuinely feel that Mark Carney is obviously a change from Trudeau. And yes, obviously he is in many respects. But I'm not necessarily convinced that means that you're going to see a wholesale change in how this government operates vis-a-vis the previous one. Who knows? I could be wrong on that. And then they wanted stability because Carney came off as change without chaos. And what we have now is a minority government. And sure, it's close. Carney should be able to broker some deals with the NDP and a couple one-offs here, maybe get some floor crossers. So it's a strong minority position to be in, but it's still a minority.
Well,
we could be heading back to the polls in the next 18 to 24 to 36 months.
If you're at 169 and it's a 172 from, you've effectively got a majority, right? Because the likelihood of everybody else aligning to defeat you so it's effectively they will be able to run as a majority government. What's interesting though is, and I think this is where there's maybe a bit of a difference between the UK and Canada. In the UK, that would not be enough because there's so much of your own side who will vote independently. Like, we vote against our own whips quite regularly in the UK Parliament. Keir Starmer's already had that with a number of MPs who voted against him. So the idea you could get to 169 or just scrape over with one or two and run sustainably in the UK would be impossible. Here, a bit more because the party discipline is so much stronger. However, even with that, this is going to be a grind for the government, right? Because if you are going to have votes, not that people seem that bothered about whether the Canadian Parliament ever meets or not, if I could just put that in again, given it's still December since Parliament met. Just the grind of you're going to need ministers there, you're going to need everybody in Ottawa for key votes. That's just a grind. I served in Parliament in the UK in minority things, and it was horrible and awful, and no one can go anywhere, no one can do anything. So that's going to be bad. But they will be able to operate as a majority, I think. More importantly is, what we failed to do actually, Joseph, you and I, we should have probably done predictions beforehand ourselves. Because we've kind of been saying both internally in our workplace and to one another, and I think on here, that we thought this is where this would roughly end up, right? It looked like I think the one thing we maybe got wrong was I think we kind of thought it would be a majority because when we had James Moore,
I thought it was a majority. I'll be honest. I thought I did not predict a minority.
But the one thing we did, I think both of us thought, was the polls are probably correct. Once Trump had occurred, the Conservative response I thought was pretty poor at the beginning, and I thought at that moment that's set in people's minds. Carney's out defending Canada and Trudeau is, and the Conservatives are still playing around on politics. Boom, these are the serious guys. And I think that was set fairly quickly. So the idea that the Conservatives could win this, I think, disappeared very, very quickly. I think where we were both probably a bit wide of the mark was, as you say, I thought the Liberals would eke out a majority.
Yeah. And I can understand why those who are extremely active on the Conservative side of the coin in campaigns would have felt differently than we did watching this a little bit more from the outside. I mean, yes, you and I worked on a bunch of campaigns and volunteered this cycle, but I can understand why there was some hesitation or perhaps a disbelief that this was the course that we were on because, I mean, look at some of the impressive numbers. This is the most number of Conservative votes since 1988. It's an exceptional showing, and yet no win. We have, like, the Conservatives flipped a whole bunch of NDP seats in southwestern Ontario, like auto manufacturing, Rust Belt, blue collar, working class ridings have done the full switch from NDP to Conservative. There's a lot of really good undercurrents of a really positive story here, and I wonder if where we're sitting at with the Conservative movement in Canada is whether we just have a significantly stronger floor than we used to have, and we're now starting to incrementally build we're starting to push the ceiling of our potential higher up. I mean, the total vote share that Pierre Poilievre was able to capture was large. Now, also, so was Carney. Carney also got a massive, 10-point difference from what Trudeau got in the last election. Still massive. I don't know if where we're really at is this two-horse race dynamic that became very clear at the start of this campaign, if that's going to become a permanent feature of federal politics the next little while. Okay,
so caution on that. Okay. 2017, what happened in the UK, both the main parties, the Conservatives and Labour scored over or close to 40%. I think it was both of them over, and it was the biggest joint share of the vote for the two main parties since like the 70s, I think, or maybe even before. I can't remember when, but anyway. And everybody thought, and there was this thing of, okay, well, everything's coalesced. That soon unravelled. It unravelled for Labour very quickly because it was, Labour had formed this new left-wing bloc under Corbyn, and all these people who'd previously been Greens and all kinds of stuff had come to them. Theirs unravelled in 19. The Conservatives built on that and then got to this 2019 coalition with a lot of the similar demographic of voter that you're talking about there. Blue-collar, working class, C, D and E category, we would call them in the UK, social class-wise, of, voter. And we thought a new coalition of Conservatives. They proved not to be reliable, and they came crashing down, and they were some of the ones who left us in big numbers in the 2024 general election because they were not a reliable base. What did the Conservatives go back to? Relying on its old traditional base of older people, right? Older voters. That was the only demographic that we basically won or were competitive in the 2024 election. So I just think these new coalitions can be built on sand, and it's very easy for these folks to, particularly if the Conservatives had won government, I think these people could very easily have said, I'm going back to the NDP then, because they're not actually doing what I expected them to do for workers. They haven't done this, haven't done that. So I'm a bit cautious about whether this... Now, the Conservatives are in opposition, right? Boris won with these people and then had to govern, and then they got very disappointed. It'll be easy to keep them in opposition.
Yeah, and I think expectations of Carney are going to be so high, and it's going to be very difficult for him to meet those expectations, no matter how good he is, just because of the crisis that he faces is real and significant. And I had a little bit of nervous energy, I'll admit, about the prospect of Pierre winning and not being able to live up to his expectations if he had won, which, I think often about the conversation we had last week with Mike McDonald, and he talked about how, there's a sort of an unwritten rule of Canadian politics of this 3+1 and done. It is so rare to get a fourth mandate, which the Liberals got. That's the 3+1, but it's almost impossible to get that fifth mandate. And you think about how high expectations are for Carney, think of the crisis he has to deal with. And I feel like he can only go in one direction from here, which is down.
Well, and they've done it on the back of people, in some respects, holding their noses and going and voting Liberal. People, some of them, people who were pissed off about lots of things the Liberals have done. Others, people who are quite left-wing, from, NDP supporters, Green supporters. These people held the nose, partly to stop the Conservatives, but, especially in response to Trump. So he has a big job of holding those people together. I don't think he will, because I can't see how you can, during a period where he's now got to kind of pivot on some of the things he said he will do on energy, oil and gas and all the rest of it, whilst now he's got people like Gregor Robertson, who's a former NDPer, who's won a seat here in Vancouver, and those kind of voters, that kind of wing of his party or of his coalition. So I think it'll be very difficult. I think most interesting thing is this has proven, some of the age-old rules of politics, which is, kind of older voters turn out. And, every time we have this conversation.
And in this case, they not only turned out, but it was essentially this. A friend put it to me this way, and I'm going to read it out. Essentially, the boomer NDPers switched to the Liberals, prevented any of the change we desperately need in Canada. So we're going to see more of these tired economic policies anchored in government picking winners, massive government spending on programs, and more bureaucracy than ever. And if anything doesn't work, the Liberals can just blame Trump.
Yes, that's probably fair. Probably a reasonable chance of that. I think the polls have proven relatively. I think I sounded like the jaded old man in some of the campaigns when I was going and talking to some of them. I said, we're having really good response on the doors. I said, yes, because there are more Conservative voters, but there are also more Liberal voters. Both things can be true, right? You can be having a much better time on the door, and the Liberals are also having a much better time because both parties had seen this boost.
Yes, that's right.
But the Liberals simply had this turnout advantage, and also the votes in the right places, right? I mean, you look at Alberta, and that's one of the things I think we discussed previously was actually the Liberals almost doubled their vote in Alberta. Alberta is more Conservative now than it was going into this election. Saskatchewan has remained very conservative. So there are some big issues coming down the line. And there were these little surprises where I kind of thought maybe the Liberals will get 4, 5, 6 seats in Alberta, and they've ended up with 2 and the NDP with 1.
Yeah.
And there's these weird results all over the place, but broadly the polls have been true. So questions for us to consider going forward. Well, actually, I think I said this to you on text earlier. There's 3 things I never want to hear in an election again, and I've been guilty of some of this myself in the past, is, oh, these rallies, these people, that's all these people coming. Well, that was the same with Jeremy Corbyn. He could get all these people into rallies, all these motivated young people. Never confuse a motivated base, which is often the most, I don't want to say extreme because that's not the right word, but the more left or the more right bit of your base who are very motivated. They're often not in the places you need them, even if it were true that they're in the wrong places. It's not a 30-year-old from a seat you need to win in Vancouver who's maybe attending these. It's people from seats where and in regions where it's not as matter. Never want to hear that. Second one is the feeling on the doorsteps doesn't reflect the polls. Well, I was warning about this to people, as you've heard me say. Like, I had a colleague who was convinced he was going to win in the UK election last year, and ended up coming third. He was the incumbent, and the doors were different. And I've said it myself. Right? I'm guilty of this myself, so I'm not like this. And then the third one is this pretense that somehow older voters. There's going to be a turnout change and elections are going to be... No, it's older voters are going to always be the people who turn out the most, right? And I just never want to hear these things again because so many people have been saying that the youthquake, as we called it in the UK, and it was disproven there. It was, at the end of the day, young people are not going to and seem to never going to vote. But these campaigns...
Well, I am on that last point. I am curious to see how the demographic split ultimately shake out at the end of this. I don't think we have all that data in.
Yeah, I don't think we have it yet. But I suspect, given where the results were, that it will be the case that the turnout advantage amongst over 55s worked very significantly in the Liberals' favour. And that for all this talk of, we've heard it from friends we have and shared colleagues who the motivation of these 30 to 40-year-olds, whatever, and the, Gen Z, it's like, well, it hasn't manifested itself. Maybe
I saw someone publish this morning on LinkedIn a youth vote, sort of mock vote. A bunch of schools participated in a mock vote across Canada, and the Conservatives came out the winner. And you see the anecdotal reasons for why they came out the winner. You saw stuff about, well, I want to be able to get a house when I'm older. I don't want to be living in my parents' basement. So all the stuff that we heard throughout the campaign as to why there was a generational gap between the Conservatives and the Liberals, which is also very odd. We're so used to the Conservatives doing much better with the older vote. So there was just such a flip this time around. But presumably, if they were motivated enough, you would see them having voted in much larger numbers than it appears they did. But my guess is I'm probably going to be wrong about this. That once we look at the numbers, we are going to see that there was a bit of a shift. There was a bit of higher participation rates among those demographics, but not enough compared to the participation rates of older demographics.
We forget that probably the majority or close to the majority of people in the 18 to 24 demographic didn't vote. Probably, and I'm prepared to be wrong on this, but I will be interested to see, and I'll pay a penalty if I'm wrong, but I suspect it will be. Yes, there may have been an increase in turnout, but it was never going to deliver what was, what some people were talking up. But I suspect we'll continue to see, as you go up the age demographic groupings, turnout will increase. And that is the age-old rule of politics, right? So, but so I think so it's kind of ended up not... The fact the Conservatives couldn't win, I think, is the position we were in a few months ago. Just didn't feel like they would be able to do it. It's closer than perhaps some people. My final thing I said to one of our colleagues, I thought there'd be a comfortable Liberal win, and I had in my head that maybe 130 to 140 seats for the Conservatives, so a bit of an increase. But seem to have outperformed that. Any standout results? I mean, obviously we've got to talk about Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, I think
any surprising results elsewhere you thought?
Well, I mean, that is the most surprising. It's one of the big surprising elements of the evening is him losing a seat. I was certainly not expecting that. I had heard others suggesting that was on the cusp. One of our colleagues had some riding specific polling numbers, and I quite honestly had a hard time believing it. So this is where I talk out of both sides of my mouth. I was prepared to believe the national polls and the direction that they were heading. I was not necessarily prepared to believe that what someone had at a local level was reflective of what would occur in the ballot box. So that's obviously, that causes a bit of a heartburn for him, because he's not going to assess what the next step looks like. That obviously, given how his speech went on election night, I assume that means he's going to try and seek a seat somewhere. That means someone in caucus is going to have to make way for him, unless something insane happens, like Mark Carney decides to play really nice and finds room in his caucus to make way for Pierre to run. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it'll have to come from within the Conservative caucus. And, I think Pierre does have a strong enough argument to make on many fronts, which is we've got this solid foundation here to work from. And I think if he's able to say, I'm going to learn from this, we're going to build back even better, then I think caucus could go, yeah, like, sure, he lost his seat, but there's a whole lot more that he's done in the last 2 years for this party. And so let's give him a second chance. And I do think we have a problem in modern day politics of being way too quick to replace our leaders after an election loss.
I wasn't being rude. I was actually just trying to get the final percentages up. Well, not final, because there's still some counting underway, right? But yeah, 43.7, wasn't it, for the Liberals, 41, which is interesting, actually, because this is the first time in 3 elections the Conservatives have lost the popular vote. The other element to this, of course, is that the Liberals have managed to win twice, isn't it, with not winning the popular vote. And the Conservatives see one of their best share of the vote for however long it was, and end up not winning the popular vote. But yeah, 41.3.
In any other context, any other normal election, that would have been a very comfortable majority win.
So this question of whether Pierre Poilievre... So two interesting questions. This one. I mean, we'll get into this when we talk to other people later in the week. But would a different leader have won? And it's funny, because I've had 2 competing theories on this now, and I was tended to the view of, like, I was making the argument to somebody that, but surely his likability ratings, which have been below the party, some of his hard edge stuff, the kind of has made it easy for Liberals unfairly, perhaps, to say he's Trumpian. Some of his language has sounded similar at times. And I said maybe that's cost, a few votes in a few key seats in more moderate mixed regions. And therefore you could lay it I said if it'd been a different leader, we would have won a majority. And I thought that's maybe where my head was going. And then someone pushed back very strongly on me and said, no, but don't understand the importance of him solidifying the base and keeping the party together, killing off any kind of threat from the right, because you've seen populist right movements basically rising everywhere. Look at the UK with Reform, even a bit in Australia, all over the place. Don't underestimate the value of that and the ability to motivate the base to get us to where we are now, which is, what was it I said, 41% of the vote. And I thought, well, fair point, actually. So, sometimes a leader can have as much of a positive as a negative. And then the question beyond that of if he goes, and I was talking to this with a few Conservative MPs, is like, you say to them, who would you replace him with? There's no obvious successor. And more importantly, they all absolutely, definitely want to now prevent any possibility of Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, putting himself forward. So just on the Poilievre thing, I was like I thought my own assumptions had to be like put back in check a bit there.
Yeah, I think, I've often remarked with a friend of ours, the speed with which the UK Tories have always been so quick to just swap out one leader for the next to meet the moment and the time. And at moments I've admired that. I'm like, man, the ability for the UK Tories to reinvent themselves to meet the moment is something that we're not nearly as good at. But on the flip side, I think you can overdo it, and sometimes you start to lose something. And I think if Pierre Poilievre can demonstrate an ability to adapt and learn and come out of this stronger, then I think he will. That the core base of voters that he mobilized and motivated heading into this election campaign, I think will be even that much more motivated in the next campaign. And so if he can just make some adjustments, and I think the big one you and I have talked about And I do believe this to be a big issue for him that I think he can turn around, is the tone issue.
Yeah.
It's now about figuring out with the right tone that's going to make you a little bit more approachable. And I'm not suggesting that means he needs to turn into a big soft red Tory and that the party needs to move towards the center or anything like that. Tone adjustments could, I think, be a single biggest net benefit on this one. And I'm not saying that because that's my own perspective on things, but I've spoken to like a couple liberals, not partisans, not people active, like straight up normal, regular voters who aren't at all active participants in the political process. And when they would tell me why they were voting Carney or going liberal instead of Conservative, the single biggest thing was I kind of want to vote Conservative, but it's just the tone. It's the tone that gets me every time. And if I could see a bit more of what Pierre's like when he is talking about his daughter, you see him when he's with his wife. He seems like a very warm, nice human being, but that's not the image of him that we're exposed to day in, day out. And so that, it doesn't take much.
Yeah, as I was saying to one of the MPs in Sasper, we had this conversation a bit, and I said, but then at the same time, there's never been an election where somebody hasn't said to me on the doors, oh, I would vote Conservative, but David Cameron, no, he's too posh. And then with Theresa May, it was, oh no, she's too aloof. And then obviously there were people with Boris who were like, oh, I could never vote for Boris Johnson. I've been a Conservative. And I say, you're always going to get this to a point, right? Of whichever the leader is, there's a bunch of Conservatives who say, oh no, he's not my type of leader. But I think with Pierre it was just a bit different, because I do think with all those other examples, particularly with Cameron and Boris, their own personal ratings always tracked above the party pretty much, or certainly the times where we needed them to at election time. Whereas Pierre's had quite poor ratings vis-a-vis, like when there was a 20-point Conservative lead, his personal ratings didn't reflect that, which meant that there was always a question of how real that lead was, I suppose. I don't know, but the question is who would be the alternative? And then he's got to get a seat in Parliament now. The problem is if he goes to a safe seat in Alberta or Saskatchewan, that kind of then plays into the thing of him of being like the kind of Western, reactionary reformer type person. I don't know whether that works for him either. But anyway, time will tell. I mean, so the bigger question is, are we going to end up in another election?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if we make it to the 4-year mark of this parliament. I think, as you say, it's exhausting running a minority government, and maybe Carney's able to pull this off, just strike a couple deals. The NDP is going to be no rush to head back into an election anytime soon. They're going to have to get themselves sorted out. Obviously, Pierre Poilievre needs to get himself sorted out. The Conservatives want to take a little bit of a moment to catch their breath and figure out the next steps. So I have to figure there's a good 12 to 18 months sort of window before we start to seriously get into election talk again. But it also just takes the crisis that we're in compounding and getting so severe that it prompts the Brits to drop, right? And the Conservatives to steel themselves and get back into it. So, yeah, it's going to be... it's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Any final takeaways then from the results when you look at them? Anything particularly interesting you thought stood out? I know we've been talking about that the whole...
Yeah, well, for the last observation, I have a bunch, and I wrote about this on the weekend, but one of the ones that I think is net new for me, sort of coming out of yesterday, is just the realization that this was not a policy election at all. And it can be frustrating for Conservatives to feel like Carney just ripped off a lot of the core Conservative ideas early on in the campaign, which I think was a smart tactical move. Potentially, you could argue was a strategic move on the Liberal part. But it meant that it was a bit more of a campaign around brands and around vibes. On my tone point earlier, who do you like? Became part of it. Which brand do you prefer? Do you prefer the bureaucratic, technical central banker or the 20-year political veteran? It just strikes me that this could have been an opportunity at the moment that we're in for some really transformative, nation-building, big, massive policy ideas, and we saw none from either party. And so it's like, if this moment doesn't create that opportunity, then what kind of campaign will?
Yeah, and people talk about, campaigns matter, campaigns don't matter. Broadly, it looks like this campaign didn't really matter. And I think we saw a bit of that coming out of the debates, right, where the debates didn't really seem to shift anything. And maybe there's a little tightening towards the end, but it's almost as if we could have not had the campaign and the result would probably broadly have been where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like everything, the frame was set before the writs were dropped.
Yes.
And then it's cemented. It's just stuck that way. And then everyone kind of just wanted the 35, 36 days to go by as quickly as we could and then move on. And I think that's what we got.
Yep.
I think the last thing I'll say is on the conservative sort of post-mortem analysis, I think everyone's got to be careful on the conservative side not to overdo it with the self-flagellation. Like there's like, you and I, even on this show, we struggled throughout the campaign to identify what we would do differently of substance beyond the tone issue, I think, and beyond the framing at the start of the campaign. But I'm not even convinced that would have been enough in and of itself to have the Conservatives win, right? So it's always easy to be the armchair quarterback. And it's always harder when you're in the thick of these things to spot these things and make the right calls.
No, totally. I think that's entirely fair. I think it was set so quickly and so early, rather. That maybe there wasn't much more that the Conservatives could have done, really. I do think there are constituencies and ridings that could have flipped if there'd been better candidates who'd worked harder, candidates who'd been picked more recently. And I've talked about this at previous ones. A couple of takeaways, really, which one of which is no value placed on local campaigning. And some of these seats that came down to not very much. I'm just like, if there actually had been a stronger candidate, maybe on all sides, but certainly a stronger Conservative candidate, I think we could have flipped a couple more of these seats if it had more time to do it. But it's not that the Conservatives didn't have the money or the knowledge that an election was coming. And then a
lot of these candidates were frankly chosen and appointed way too late in the game. So
way too late. And there were controversies with some of them, and why were they given this? But what I would do now, but to solve that problem, I'd sort out my nominations now. I would nominate as many candidates early, so you give them as much time as possible to prep. But it frustrates the hell out of me when you talk to campaigns here. There is absolutely no real value placed on local factors, and it's just written off. I've even had people tell me on campaigns, "Oh no, but Canada's not like the UK." No, the public are the same. If you have a name who's seen as local, seen as working on stuff, you will move people's minds if they keep hearing from you and keep seeing you and you're talking to them about the issues they care about. That will change some minds, right? It will change some minds.
It also de-risks the potential of the moment negative impacts of either the party brand or the leader brand. Totally. So it's so rare that the local candidate will have a really strong positive local brand, and that is hurtful to them, and as a result, hurtful to the party as a whole. The party benefits from having very strong local candidates. The best case scenario is you have a really strong local candidate who's got a name for him or herself, is well respected in the community. And then if you are good at the national level of creating a really good brand halo around your party brand and around the leader's brand, then you're stacking up your positives.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to be lost by having strong local candidates with good community impact.
No, I think there's a perception here that it just doesn't matter. And I find it strange, and I have this conversation with various people, and it's like, oh no, we don't, it wouldn't work the same here. Like, what? I think it would. Anyway, my final one is just a process issue. I've helped in lots of Canadian elections, but I've never really hung around for polling day because I was always having to be back and forth. I found it really bizarre. Unlike in the UK, where we bring all the polling boxes, all the ballot boxes to one central location. It's called The Count, and every polling station box from that constituency is opened there in front of the candidates, their teams, and you do your sampling of each polling box, and then they announce the result on the stage with all the candidates stood together. Here, they count the ballot boxes in the polling station they're in, and then just telephone through the results. And you can send scrutineers, but you have 100 polling stations, right? 100 polls. You've got to have 100 people to go to each one, and then they telephone you through. So we were sitting there looking at the TV, CTV and CBC, and refreshing to find out what was happening in that constituency where you're the MP and the candidate, right? I thought, this is just, to me, I was like, this is mad. And then, Matt was re-elected without ever having seen a single ballot paper on that evening, which to me, and it's the same for most candidates, right? I just thought, this is weird, because the thing in the UK is you turn up to the count, you see all the ballots, and then they stack them up so you can see your number going up as the night progresses, and then as the result is announced, you're standing there with all of the ballots stacked up for each candidate. And so it's that physical thing of seeing it and being there. And like, I see the ballot boxes and I remember that my power as a member of parliament comes, and my legitimacy comes through those ballots and those ballot boxes that I'm stood in front of. I just think it's a very beautiful thing of reminding people. And the one I always tell the story of before, sorry to rant about this, is like, when Margaret Thatcher's re-elected in 1983, she's kind of at the height of her powers, and in 87, and she's there at her local count with all of the candidates who stood against her, and there's a public declaration, so they announce her result, and then of course they're going through all the candidates, of which one of them is Lord Buckethead of the Gremloids Party, and he stood 4 or 5 candidates down from her with a bucket on his head as Lord Buckethead, and there is just nothing more humbling and as a reminder than that moment where you are there remembering this is democracy in action, this is where the power comes from at the ballot box. And but also just the high drama of it, right? Just the high drama of, the guy I replaced as the MP in 2010 had to stand on stage next to me as the result was announced, and I'm taking his job off him. Now, we were nice to each other. Often that's not the case. So I just love and it takes for hours as well, right? So polls close at 10. You don't get your result often until 4, 5, 6 in the morning, sometimes later. And you're all there. It's just the high drama of it. Just didn't have the high drama of hitting refresh on CBC. Right. I was like, to see how you're doing. I was like, this is mad. I was like, I just found it really bizarre. I thought, sorry to rant about that, but it's just like, I just prefer that drama of and yeah, candidates don't all turn up at 10 o'clock at night. I was a bit unusual that I would turn up early because I love organised elections. And some candidates will but their teams are there and you know what's going on. And also the only way you actually know is when the results finally announced. You don't get this blow by blow, 4 polling stations have reported and this is the result up to now.
All in one go.
All at one go at the end. So anyway, I like the drama of it. Anyway, this has gone on far too long.
Canadian politics, we're not known for being particularly dramatic.
But also there was just some and there's always pushing and shoving in the count because you're trying to get in to scrutinise to get your sample from that polling box so you know how you've done. Because we also don't get given poll results. So you never know what the result was in each polling station. You only get the total result. The only way you find out is at that count. A box comes in and they'll say, this is, Pollington. Get a sample of 100 from there. They'll tell you how many people have voted in that box. You do your sample of 100 and then you put it in your Excel. You'd probably have a much better thing than Excel. You'd probably design some AI thing to predict the result. But anyway, we normal human beings. See, that's the only way you know.
But does that mean you don't know how the vote, what the voter turnout was poll by poll?
Yeah, you do. They tell you. They'll say this is the Pollington polling station. There are 350 ballots in here. And so there are 700 electors or whatever. They say there's 350 ballots in the box, and then they open the box, verify there are 350 ballots, and at that point you do the sampling. Then they put them all back in, and then once they've verified every ballot box to say that the number of ballots that have arrived match with those issued on the day, then they open them all again and separate them by candidate. So you do your sampling at that first stage of so you do 100 sample in each box, or maybe a bit more if you've got more people around, to just trying to find out what your percent is in that polling station. So that's the only way you can find out how you're doing across the polls in your constituency.
Sounds rather quaint and exciting.
This was like a teaching, wasn't it, at the end there?
Yeah, it was. Well, let's finish it with tasting notes. How's your beer tasting?
Yeah. Well, this is a delicious, I'm having a little bit more, hazy pale by the Dale Dug a Hole. It's just light, very citrusy, but I get very high lemon notes. It's kind of sweet, a little bit of tangerine, but it's only 5.5%. So I find just when something's a pale, I find pale ale sometimes just kind of fall away a bit, and I'm a bit I should just have had a lager, or I should just have got a proper IPA. But this is actually really lovely.
No, it's a good brewery. They make good stuff. This Dead Frog Pepper Lime Lager is as advertised. A little bit of pepper, a little bit of lime in a lager. It's crisp.
You're really expressive today, Joseph. My pepper lime lager is peppery, limey, and lagery.
And lime.
Well,
please, we tuned in to get your notes. Sometimes it is what it is. We don't need to overdo it with the tasting notes.
Have you read your tasting notes on Untapped? It's like floating to earth on a soft pillow. It's like, what? What?
Maybe that should be a new segment. We should get AI to write tasting notes and then compare it to mine and see which one's real and authentic. Oh, all right, guys. Right. I think that's it. We intended to keep this one short. We'll be back later in the week with an interview with Sean Spear, the managing editor of The Hub. We'll do a deeper breakdown on what this all means.
And I'll try not to look like shit. Bye-bye.